Though the incoming administration had a busy first week with both the pen and actions.
Yes.
Most notably sending illegal immigrants back to their country of origin. I think what caught my attention, Larry, was Colombia rejecting them initially until Trump threatened tariffs.
Yes.
So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of tariffs.
Okay. Well, Trump is also talking not only in Colombia, but tariffs in general, 10% across the board tariffs on all products coming into the country. And 25% on China or 50% depending upon the deal, and increasing tariffs for Mexico and Canada unless they do something about immigration and do certain things. The thing to remember about tariffs is it basically is an economic tax on the consumer. You know, Trump is talking about it being on the countries against Mexico and Canada. If we have a 10% across the board increase in tariffs, that means basically products will increase in price. Because when you have a widget that costs $100 and you put a 10% tariff on that, that widget now costs $110. And who pays that extra $10? It's the consumer who pays it. The importing company or organization that buys the product from China for an additional, now pays, instead of paying $100, is paying $110. And the difference is the consumer ultimately pays for it, but the $10 is collected by the U.S. Customs and goes to the U.S. Treasury. So it's a tax. The tariff's a tax.
So there could be some advantages, but disadvantages could be inflation's already high. We don't want to see higher inflation, or it stay where it is.
Yeah. And also it protects inefficient industries. I mean, back in the 1800s, late 1800s, the U.S. had the highest tariffs in the world to protect its domestic manufacturing bases of steel, railroads, and everything else. And the United States grew to be the #1 economic power in the world, in part due to the tariff protections. And it also protected the consumers from taxes and other things. Finally, there wasn't enough, because at that one time, tariffs were the major source of revenue for the government. And as the government increased, the tariffs couldn't keep pace, and then we ended up with the income tax.
As President Trump is suggesting to bring in tariffs to help with the government.
Yeah, it isn't going to happen. You couldn't.
Well, before we go any further, Larry, let me welcome back our listeners to the Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, back with our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford. Thank you, Larry, for the intro. And Larry recently wrote this article on Tariffs Are Taxes. Yes. It'll be out this week. You can check it out on our website, www.ascf.us. Also sign up for our newsletter, and please consider a donation to ASCF. Okay, Larry, now let's get back to what you were saying there, because it was right along with the questions I wanted to point out about inflation.
Okay.
And it looks like in the case of Colombia, his threats worked.
Yes.
But as you were talking about, if he does this blanket tariff across the board here, do you believe we're going to see inflation stay where it's at or go higher at all?
I have no problem using all the tools available to the government to reciprocate with countries that are not in our interest or doing stuff to us that they shouldn't be doing. So Colombia had a deal to take back the immigrants. The planes were in the air, U.S. military planes. When they were in the air, Colombia says, no, we're not going to accept them. So they had made a deal and they broke it. So that's what really ticked them off, because Mexico told the U.S., no, you can't send military planes to Mexico, but I don't see him getting worked up about tariffs against Mexico on the immigration stage anyways. The economics of the other matter. But tariffs basically are a tax, and so generally speaking, the lower the better. And the problem is that China has subverted the World Trade Organization with its tariffs on its own, so it prevents American Western countries from operating in China unless they turn over all their trade secrets.
I know, and I wanted to get to that because I want to bring back the fact we discussed manufacturing of strategic national security issues, bringing that back to the U.S.
Yes.
But you also made another point in your paper about an advantage to the tariffs is protecting domestic industries from foreign competition.
Precisely.
Which I would say would be very helpful against the Chinese state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to make a blanket condemnation of tariffs because from a security viewpoint, it can be very useful in protecting domestic industry. We should have a steel industry and so we can manufacture tanks and ships and planes. So we have to protect our industries to some extent. But on the other hand, if you have too high tariffs, then you protect the domestic industry. They get fat, lazy, and inefficient, and eventually they just wither away because of their incompetency. And tariffs, for example, have always been high in Latin America. They had high tariffs on their cars and everything else. And they've been very inefficient and not competitive on a world stage. So the tariffs, generally should not be used as an economic tool. Now, if you want to use them as a political tool, that's another matter. So in China, since China is not reciprocating with us in the standard way that we think of trade, it's not free trade. There's no such thing as free trade with China. That we should really start clamping down on China and start raising tariffs on Chinese goods to protect American goods, and also to say, hey, we're not going to subsidize your state-controlled industries because they subsidize a lot of their industries. So I have no problem clamping down on China. I have a problem clamping down on Canada, who's an ally of ours. I have a problem clamping down on Western Europe, who are our allies. And again, they have tariffs on American goods and the wines and cheeses and all that sort of stuff. But that's chump change. You have to look at it from a security viewpoint. And China's the bad guy. So we should be taking steps to prevent them. And tariffs don't always work. Look, we've had tariffs against Cuba for 60 years, and embargoes, and what could have
hasn't done anything.
Hasn't done anything good with Russia. Russia's surviving very nicely because they're making deals with China.
I would say because they're going elsewhere, which brings up a point of a disadvantage to tariffs, where possibly we might see more countries wanting to join, like the BRICS.
Precisely.
So they can get away from the U.S. dollar being so effective in their country.
I think maybe Trump with all these tariffs is going to speed up this whole clash of civilization that you and I have talked about in the past, Joy, where I see Western civilization forming one block, the Chinese forming another sort of block, the undeveloped countries forming another block. So I see civilization sort of getting together to fend off the others. And the Huntington book, Samuel Huntington's book there, South America could be described as being a separate civilization. I mean, North America, U.S. and Canada, was basically formed by Protestant Anglos. South America was formed by Latin Catholics, and there's a different cultural aspect to the culture of a Catholic society versus a Protestant one which believes in individual freedom. We wouldn't have the United States in individual freedom if it weren't for the Protestant ethic of the individual.
And then again, you also see the same, well, you can make a good point for another third block, because you don't really have the same Latin American view as you see with these authoritarian regimes like China.
That's right. So you have the Chinese civilization, you have the Indian civilization, you have the Japanese civilization, the European civilization. So there's maybe 6 or 7 different civilizations, but the big one is China, because they're the biggest nation in the world as far as, well, they're not anymore in population, but close to it.
India has taken that over.
Still 1.4 billion Chinese. There's a lot of Chinese versus the United States of 340, 350 million.
And as we were discussing on another episode here on BRICS, not every country in BRICS is going to agree with China's way of doing things, and they might be a little leery of it. Yes. So I could see another block coming out of this.
Yeah, we've discussed BRICS before, and they want to get the economic blocks. And so a lot of nations, I can't say I blame them, wanted to join BRICS because there'll be economic benefits and trade agreements and so forth. But that leads to the Belt and Road Initiative, China too, so then you have the whole thing of the Belt and Road where the Chinese lend money, give money to developing countries to build roads, build railroads and ships and ports. And usually there's a catch to it. And the catch is that if they can't pay it back, the Chinese take over the assets like they've done in Sri Lanka. And also, there's a dam. Dams in South America, and there's a dam somewhere else, I think it might be in Africa, built by the Chinese And the workmanship is kind of shoddy, so now they're talking about, I know it was in Tibet. And that's another subject too, where the Chinese conquered Tibet too. But anyways, there's a huge dam up in Tibet that's showing signs of breaking apart, and the shoddy workmanship by the Chinese. So this whole Belt and Road Initiative is a two-edged sword also. It's helped some people, but it's also corrupted a lot of people too.
Which is why I'm sure other countries are going to be leery in the future here.
Yeah.
But along the line with China, on these higher tariffs, if Trump does what he says he was going to do you see the U.S. bring back manufacturing from China?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's happening now. A lot of it's not going to come back to the U.S. I mean, especially the things like clothing and things like that's going to go to Vietnam, which again, the irony of irony. I know Vietnam's a communist country, but they're no great fans of the Chinese. They're both communist countries. So the trade deficit, interestingly enough, the trade deficit in China is like 273 million, and Vietnam's not too far behind as far as how much of a trade deficit the United States has with them too. So,
well, like you said, they've already moved a lot of stuff over. I think to avoid some of our tariffs, they're moving it to Vietnam and Bangladesh,
places like
neighboring
that.
countries.
Yeah.
Well, another disadvantage you discuss is that you said in the beginning, insulating these companies from competition can lead to stagnation.
Yes.
But as you also said, we had these high tariffs back in the industrial age to build up our economy.
Yeah.
So from a peace through strength strategy perspective, do you believe the U.S. needs these tariffs again until we can rebuild our manufacturing industry? Or rely on our allies instead of China?
Well, I think we should do both, but we should be selective in the tariffs. That's why I get concerned. When government gets involved, they're not real surgeons. They're kind of just a sledgehammer approach, and that's what concerns me about this blanket tariffs, because it's going to affect our friends as well as our enemies. So if we just affected the enemies, that would be one thing. And of course, enemies today might be friends tomorrow too. We need to look no further than Germany and Japan. So. Or Vietnam, for that matter, right? So,
so there's advantages and disadvantages either way you look at it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your input, Larry, and discussing these tariffs. Check out Larry's paper discussing tariffs are taxes this week. It will be out.
And I'm sure if we had a conversation a month from now or 2 months from now, there'll be different kind of tariffs that we can be talking about the way things are going. But it certainly worked with the Colombia situation.
Yes,
I'm not so sure it's going to work to our advantage with Canada. So.
And it may not work with Putin and Ukraine.
It hasn't so far.
So every country's a different situation. We'll see as we proceed, or as the new administration proceeds.
We're living in interesting times.
We certainly are. As I said, it was a very busy week, and I'm sure it'll be a busy 4 years.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Larry.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate your time, and thank you to our listeners. You can subscribe, share, and comment on our YouTube and Rumble channels. Let us know your thoughts on tariffs. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Substack, and listen to your favorite audio podcast on your Apple or Android phone. Join us again next time as I bring you the Peace Through Strength podcast.